Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture from a slightly more informal setting. I'm excited today to be discussing Mark Noll's The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which is an important book. And joining us today to discuss that is former HSF contributor and pastor in Missouri, Jackson Watts. So Jackson's going to start us off by telling us a little bit about the origins of the book and the significance of it and the reception of it. So Jackson, go ahead and get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Glad to be with you. We both kind of agreed up front that this book is serious. It has been influential, but it's also complicated. And maybe a less polite way to say complicated is it's frustrating. But nevertheless, things that frustrate us shouldn't deter us from engaging with them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this book and its relevance to our work. But where it came from, I think, is also interesting. So in the early 90s, Pew Charitable Trust, which is an organization that gives out lots and lots of grant money, they gave grants to 3 authors to explore this question: why has theology disappeared from the evangelical church? Pretty provocative question. And they ended up getting back in response 3 very different books from these 3 authors. One of them I happen to like a lot, but Noll's book, clearly out of the 3, has sold the most. It's been discussed the most, and it's kind of become the touchstone book that when you want to talk about like the state of the evangelical world in terms of scholarship, in terms of intellectual output, and what that's been like, this has kind of become a go-to book. The new edition that we're discussing is not very different from the original. It just has a new preface and afterword. So we'll come to that a little bit. But again, it's been very influential. Noll wrote a follow-up book in 2013, which was shorter and a little bit more targeted, trying to be practical. We'll leave that for another day. And then, Jesse, you've read the Carl Trueman book, The Real Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, in which he takes kind of a different approach to the question or the issue at hand. But we're, of course, focusing on Noll's original book. So here's the relevance. What is the state of the evangelical mind? And Noll's answer to that is kind of the question or the statement that's resonated with a lot of people and provoked a lot of people. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. And it's important here to just say what he means by evangelical mind, because throughout the book, it's a fairly lengthy book, he doesn't always mean the same thing. In some places, he uses that phrase as shorthand for serious evangelical scholarship. In other places, he just seems to mean careful thinking. In other places, he just seems generally concerned about loving God with our minds, which, of course, is a concern that resonates with us that we can appreciate. I would say ultimately he is concerned both about the quality of our thinking as well as scholarly output. So whether that's what we're doing or what's coming from professors or what's coming from pulpits or what's coming from the pew, I think he would say he's concerned about all of those. And so should we be as well. So we can take this seriously because as people who have been told to love the Lord with our minds, among other things, we should appreciate the topic. We can't help but consider such claims. And I just want to share a very brief quote here because I think Noll puts his finger on the matter pretty helpfully. He says, "Scholarship is not the most important thing in the Christian life. It is self-evident for a religion to which not many are called from the wise by human standards, that a believer may live and die an exemplary existence without pursuing the questions of a scholar. But the intellectual life is still important. It is one of the arenas where God has made in which to live out our days. It is a legitimate sphere in which Christians may be active. It is one of those activities carried on in the body of Christ." And then he goes on to say, if evangelicals acknowledge that it is appropriate as a Christian to be the best ball player or lawyer or bank executive or auto mechanic or operator of a janitorial service or owner of a retirement home or third grade teacher, that God has made it possible for a person to be, why do evangelicals find it difficult to believe that it is also appropriate as a Christian to cultivate the life of the mind as thoroughly as it can be cultivated? And so you have a lot of great quotes in the book like that on the face of it, you can't help but agree with. So that's a little bit of just kind of getting us into the subject. Jesse, I'm going to kick it back over to you because you've spent a lot of time working through the broader argument, which in part is a largely historical argument, though not entirely. So walk us through that a little bit. Help us think about how he makes this assertion about there not being much of an evangelical mind and why that's the case.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying a significant portion of his argument is a historical argument, and he spends probably 150 pages or so, and even the pages beyond that, dealing with some of the historical background and the roots of this. I think Noll's argument is essentially a nuanced historical case that the seeds of evangelical anti-intellectualism, if we can call it that, can be found within the very history of evangelicalism. So he's looking at the history of evangelicalism and saying, what we see today, and I think in some part that is anti-intellectualism, can be found in the very history of that. So I'm going to try to walk through some of that, hopefully as quickly as we can, give some of the nuance, but maybe not get bogged down too much in the particulars. Noll argues that Protestants had placed significant value on the life of the mind. We could see this in the Reformers. He points to Calvin, to Luther, to the medieval scholastics as well. He even says the Puritans saw significant value not only in the life of the mind, but taking intellectual pursuits seriously and applying those pursuits to all of life. So in one place he says, the distinguishing characteristic of Puritanism was its effort to unite the theology of the Reformation with a comprehensive view of the world. But Noll goes on to say that evangelicals don't share this Puritan, comprehensive, holistic view of the life of the mind and applying that to the world. So they don't share this Puritan emphasis. So how is this the case? What happened? So according to Noll, the roots of this, he thinks, can be found in pietism, the pietism of the 16th and 17th centuries that finds its way into the first and second Great Awakenings. In one place he says, pietists rediscovered that Christianity is a life as well as a set of beliefs. So it's a life and a set of beliefs. And he thinks this is a good thing. But the problem with pietism and the influence of pietism on the first and second Great Awakening is essentially in its excesses. So again, to quote Noll, he says, the difficulty arose when some pietists began to view Christian faith as only a life, without a concern for beliefs at all. This led to a fascination with practice, deep involvement in spiritual experience, and absorption in the psychological dimensions of the faith. Objective realities of revelation were sometimes totally eclipsed. So pietism and the awakenings are intended to be a spiritual renewal, and Noll sees that as a good thing. But the problem is he sees that as displacing intellectual pursuits by placing experience and the individual kind of at the center of things. And the result is that evangelicals have become pragmatic, populist, charismatic, and technological. So let me just go over quickly 4 historical phenomena that Noll sees as shaping American evangelicalism. And the 4 phenomena are revivalism, the separation of church and state, Christian American synthesis that he sees as connected with the American Revolutionary period, and then early 20th century fundamentalism. So let's start with revivalism. Essentially, revivalism, as I've kind of already said, emphasizes charisma. It emphasizes the charisma of the preacher. We can think of folks like George Whitefield, charismatic speakers. It focuses on the individual, and it undercuts the authority of churches. So in essence, Noll is saying revivalism is driven by populism, and he sees this as leading to a sort of anti-intellectualism. For Noll, revivalism is, and these are the 3 terms he uses, activistic, immediatistic, and individualistic. The second thing he points out, the second historical phenomenon, is the separation of church and state. Essentially, churches after the separation of church and state, when you don't have established churches and parishes, a parish church system, Noll sees churches as basically competing for parishioners. It takes on a sort of economic business sort of thing where we're competing for people. He then points out
By
this.
the way, let me jump in here real quick. So just to clarify, like, because when you hear separation of church and state, we think, yeah, that's not a good thing. But then we kind of do need it. But he's not really actually wading into the legal question about church and state. He's just saying because of the way this evolved in the American context, this is just the state of affairs that ended up resulting, right? Because I just think the listener, when they hear separation of church and state, their minds are going to go off in a couple of different directions. But that's not really what Noll's about there, right?
Yeah, I think so. Now Noll has his own views on the validity of the American Revolution and things like that. But yeah, what he's saying is when you don't have a parish church system, when you don't have an established church, when it's basically churches of various denominations and they're competing essentially for adherents or for parishioners, it creates a different dynamic when you might have a church in a given area and the people who live in that locale simply attend that church, like you would have had in England with the Church of England. So the third historical phenomenon is a Christian American synthesis. And with this Christian American synthesis, Noll basically is saying that some key features of American life around the time of the Revolution, philosophical ideas, a whole host of things, economic ideas, Christians begin to embrace those. So I'll just give you the four of them quickly without going into much detail. He says, American evangelicals adopted Republican theories of politics. They took as their own democratic theories of society that emphasized the individual. They embraced liberal views of the economy, and he says with little thought. And then they domesticated the Enlightenment for Christian purposes. Now that last point is a significant one for Noll. He basically argues that evangelicals in the 18th and 19th centuries embraced what one historian has called the didactic Enlightenment. And so to just give a brief explanation of that, he says they, like some of the founders, appealed to Scottish common sense philosophy and Scottish common sense reasoning, believing that certain truths from things like the existence of God to traditional morality with right reason were self-evident. So even the teachings of Scripture were considered self-evident. So when we apply the right method to the Bible, the right results are almost guaranteed. So basically, Christianity and the Enlightenment at that period are wed together. But that creates a problem as we get to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century by the new science coming on stage. And he's thinking particularly here of evolutionary science. And he says the academy is no longer hospitable to evangelical Christianity. And so then there is this conflict between Christianity and the new science. And this creates all sorts of issues. As evangelicals are trying to figure out how to deal with the new science and evolutionary theory, some embrace it and become what are called modernists, and they revise Christian doctrine. Others reject it and stick to traditional Christian beliefs, and they're often referred to as fundamentalists. And some are somewhere in between, and they're often referred to as moderates. But Noll focuses on fundamentalism in particular because he thinks fundamentalism is a significant danger to evangelicalism. In fact, he refers to fundamentalism as a disaster that affects American evangelicalism.
Yeah, he calls it an intellectual disaster, right?
Yeah, the intellectual disaster of fundamentalism. So for Noll, evangelicalism prior to the rise of evolutionary science and the academy's turn away from conservative Christianity had been given, in his opinion, to proof texting. And he thinks that's not damaging to Christianity as long as there's sort of a social consensus. Everyone agrees basically on Christian morality and things like that. The problem occurs, though, when the academy and society begins to turn away from those things. So the academy in particular, he says there's the rise of the research university, where new schools like the University of Chicago, as an example, funded by, I think, Rockefeller, is put together by businessmen, and the boards are made up of businessmen, and they're not interested in evangelical theology. So Noll actually says concerning this, with the rise of the new university, evangelical thinking, which had previously existed in tension between academic and populist styles, became almost exclusively populist. So Noll thinks that fundamentalism made a great contribution in the sense that it preserved what he calls the supernatural nature of Christianity. But he thinks there's sort of a long-term damaging effect of anti-intellectualism. So he actually uses this illustration, essentially, or image of a cancer patient. And he says, like a cancer patient receiving treatment, and again, this is his analogy, the patient survived. But at least for the life of the mind, what survived was a patient horribly disfigured by the cure itself. And then finally, looking again at the 20th century, he identifies the holiness movement, dispensational premillennialism, and Pentecostalism as contributing to anti-intellectualism. So he doesn't see these things as sort of acting together. In fact, a lot of times these movements are at odds with one another. But he says they all emphasize or stressed the dangers of the world, the comforts of separated piety, the centrality of evangelism, and an expectation of the end, that is, the end of the world. Let me give you one other quote that I think summarizes this well. And he's referring here to dispensationalism, which he says is sort of the most intellectual form of fundamentalism. And he's referring to the elaborate charts and diagrams. He says, evangelicals pushed analysis away from the visible present to the invisible future. Evangelicals almost totally replaced respect for creation with a contemplation for redemption. Now, at the end of the day, Noll is just saying these are sort of patterns of thought within these various historical developments. These are patterns of thought that lead to evangelical anti-intellectualism. So he sees all of these things as contributing factors that created sort of the scandal of the evangelical mind, which Jackson has already said that there is no mind. That's essentially Noll's assessment. Jackson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's you can't understate the fact that Noll despises what fundamentalism did to an intellectually serious Christianity. You just can't understate that. And it's not so much you can say, well, the church should have adapted or evolved, but it's almost more like they should have sort of had a more open mind to how scientific claims could be compatible with orthodox uh, theology, Orthodox Christian thought. I mean, it's important to remember Noll sees himself as an evangelical writing for evangelicals. And so, yeah, but no, it's a dense argument, but it's something to really think about. So I'm going to just kind of keep us going here because I want to talk about some of the strengths of what Noll does before we get to some weaknesses. I know we're eager to do that, but again, he is quite critical of what has happened in the evangelical world, but he sees. This is a quote, and this book is an epistle from a wounded lover. He feels like his church in some ways has left him behind. Whether that's true or not is a different question. I think some of the stuff that you just walked through, some of that historiography is very important. There are clearly some connections. There's some patterns there. And there's some pieces of that I think probably the average person, certainly the armchair historian, might not see as connected. And I think he makes a compelling case that some of it is. One thing that I think I had underappreciated coming to this book more recently is that a lot of people had been helped by this book to be encouraged to pursue scholarship. And I was thinking about an old colleague of mine from seminary, Nathan Finn, who's been a church historian and administrator in a few different schools now for a number of years. And he cites this book as really inspiring him and other people in his generation to pursue scholarship. So you can't sneer at that. You have to say, well, thank God it was encouraging. It wasn't just a biting critique, but it was a call to the life of the mind. But I think the big picture thing that he says, I think even if we disagree about the extent of the problem, I would say there certainly clearly are some problematic thought patterns among evangelicals. And this is where what Noll says is not unique to him. I can't tell you how many books I've read over the last 15 years that were critiques of some sort of evangelical thought trajectory, some sort of way that evangelicals had dumbed things down in the way that they approach the church or in the way that they approach knowledge, just sort of maybe making a bifurcation between knowledge of the scriptures versus knowledge of everything else. Somehow, if you're going to be a really serious Christian thinker, you've got to be a theologian in the traditional sense. You can't, being a sociologist is somehow not as respectable. So I appreciate that he is saying that. Again, we're going to talk maybe about this a little bit later, but this problem really isn't unique to evangelicalism. But any of us that have trafficked in our circles long enough, we know that even our own church, our own denomination, Free Will Baptist, we're not always necessarily known for being really good thinkers. And that's something we have to grapple with. I think maybe one thing I've thought about a lot as a pastor in the last few years, especially coming out of COVID, and that actually has some interesting intersections with this, but I do want to say that despite you and me and how we are both anxious about just saying, well, these are the established facts of the matter, and we just need to get on board. Like, we're very reticent to buy into that naive way of looking at, the consensus, which can change. But I will say this: I've heard a lot of Christians say things. It's almost like there is this inherent suspicion of anything called expertise, which I think is problematic because, here you are. You're sitting there in your office, you're working at an educational institution, and part of the assumptions, the undergirding assumptions of being able to engage in what you're doing is that you can learn about things, you can gain a certain level of expertise, and you can impart that knowledge to students who can trust that you're giving them, by and large, a faithful account of things. And in a similar way, for me in the pulpit each week, and I know you're in the pulpit each week too, like learning the biblical languages and learning about history and learning theology, it's based on an assumption about what we can know and how we can develop knowledge and growth. And I don't think we want to create an environment in our churches and in our denomination where people think that, just because some authority said this, well, you need to immediately be suspicious. We don't want to develop epistemic habits in people where, again, basically, if they don't feel it in their heart or they didn't see their favorite, populist preacher tweet about it, then they can't trust it. We don't want to foster that. So I see some of what Noll is doing here as offering something in response to that, at least a diagnosis, even if the diagnosis may be off in some ways. So anyway, that's a mouthful, I know, but maybe help me here. You think I'm overstating or understating any of these strengths?
No, I tend to agree with that. I don't think there's any getting around the fact that evangelicals can be inclined towards anti-intellectualism. And I do think he's right in saying that it is possible to so emphasize the individual and even conversion that we act as if God's world, his created order and the life of the mind is irrelevant, or that it really isn't all that significant. And I don't think that's the picture that you get from Scripture. And so I think the way in which this has encouraged Christians and even Christian academics to pursue the life of the mind and scholarship and things like that are really important. And I think he's also saying, if we're going to make a difference in broader society, withdrawing from the academy and withdrawing from academic pursuits, and either he has one place where he says evangelicals have been prone to either retreat sort of into their a pious, almost sort of monasticism, or to protest. Those are kind of the only two responses that we have: retreat or protest, rather than engaging in the process. Now, I think we'd have to admit that there are some difficulties for evangelicals engaging in some academic circles or things like that where they might be excluded, and Noll admits as much. But as far as encouraging us to consider a holistic view of Christianity that isn't just merely about the soul, but is also about the mind and the body and the created order and all of those things, I think it's very beneficial.
Yeah. Well, let's not let him off the hook, though. We're gonna. This is the fun part now, where we get to say.
Well, I think we've been very patient. We've been very patient.
Yes, we have. So we can walk through these sort of maybe in any particular order, I suppose. I know we've written a few things down here. One thing you keep saying, and I think it comes out like it's almost like what do you really want, Mark? Like that's like a really practical thing because sometimes he's unclear about what he really wants. And what I mean is that what would it look like for these goals of his to attain? Is it about scholarship? And does he have too narrow a view of scholarship? Sometimes it seems that way. Is this about overall intellectual discipline? Is it about and again, you get this feeling in several places like it's about not being seen as backwards intellectually by the world at large. And that seems to be a concern of his. I think he says it a bit too much to not, take seriously. Um, so you've said that a lot, and I agree. I think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to know, yeah, especially you get this in, I think the new preface or afterward. He says evangelicals have gotten published from, reputable university presses, and there have been these great advances. But then he complains about people in the pews and how he still thinks they're very um, sort of populistic. And like you were saying earlier, they don't want to listen to experts, and they don't want to listen to, they would rather listen to someone on social media rather than supposed experts. And so so at the end of the day, I'm just thinking, what does he want? Does he want, the little old lady in the pew to be reading academic journals and to only listen to NPR? Or I don't really know what he wants.
Well, there's something in what you said there that it's a good segue to it in a second. And this is a big gripe I have or complaint I have. I think he fails to appreciate. He mentions it once or twice, but not in a substantive way, in my opinion. He fails to appreciate how anti-intellectualism is a larger American phenomenon, and it's by no means distinctive of evangelical Christianity. Richard Hofstadter was writing about this in the 60s. He sort of implies that the larger American public takes established knowledge and the scientific consensus more seriously. But even in just the last few years, even if you felt like you kind of need to listen to the government experts on COVID, some of the greatest critics of that have not been evangelical Christians. It's just been other folks, sometimes other scientists, sometimes just people that are otherwise kind of crazy, maybe on social media. Sometimes people that had maybe some sort of actual serious vocational position. And so again, it's not unique to our circles. I feel like some of the things he says, I'm like, yeah, and I guess Orthodox Muslims would be that way to some extent, and the African American church would be that way. Now, where he's right is like you could say that given our doctrinal commitments and our commitments to love the Lord with our mind, we have a greater basis to not be anti-intellectual than other people, and I would agree with that. But the problem, the widespread cultural anti-intellectualism, it's just something that's characteristic of American life, and unfortunately, we're implicated in it. For better
This
or for
is
worse.
something you've said before. It's like when the majority of Americans are just sort of have their face buried in TikTok. Anti-intellectualism isn't just an evangelical problem, and I'm fine with him dealing with it as sort of an in-house issue. It's like, hey, I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm gonna speak to evangelical Christians on this point. But you're right. He acts like it's almost exclusively an evangelical phenomenon, and I find that to be untrue, but also very frustrating.
Yeah, and I mean, and I guess we kind of maybe skipped over something more fundamental. We just the fact that we're using the word evangelical and evangelicalism over and over, it presupposes that we all have a shared definition of what that is. And even Noll, in both the original volume and this updated volume, he concedes the complexity of developing a definition of evangelicalism such that you could say there is an evangelical problem in this area or that area. But I've looked at so many different sources that can have the number of evangelicals anywhere from, say, 10% to maybe 35% of Americans. And that's a huge disparity, I think, when you think about like who are we measuring here? Who are we evaluating? Are we going to go with the self-identified evangelical way of looking at it, or are we going to go with like the people that actually go to church ever, right? And that's a problem that we'll always have in this area. But one thing I know you and I also are kind of frustrated about it's not just his point about evolution. And again, he just comes to that a lot. It's that I think Noll has a simplistic view of science and Christianity and also scientific consensus. Again, we can't underestimate this point. He's very frustrated with the inability of evangelicals to sort of get on board with the evolutionary consensus, even though that consensus is more tenuous these days than it's been in a while. He throws out words like harmonization. At least I feel like he used that word, and that's a fraught term among historians of science, philosophers of science. I think Noll really needs a fuller account of how established knowledge is developed, how it is open to revision. I mean, a good historian will know that, and just the sort of how what our scientific knowledge is can evolve. And yes, that's pun intended. So there you go. So yeah, that's probably the nicest way I can state my frustrations with his approach to what he says about science.
Yeah, and maybe we should say something quickly about that. A lot of Noll's argument and a lot of what he says is related to evolutionary theory, and it's kind of like Christians haven't taken evolutionary theory seriously enough. They've treated the Bible like a science textbook, and they should have taken it more seriously. I think that's one of his critiques of fundamentalism, and I think that's one of the critiques that he would still have even today. In one place, basically, he says Christians should be upset. It's fine. Evangelicals would be fine to be upset. That sort of capital S science has been treated almost like a religion. And I think that is the case for most conservative evangelicals. So he seems to get that point. But at the end of the day, it's still as if he wants us to. It's as if we don't take evolutionary theory seriously enough. Then it's almost as if we can never be considered intellectually serious. That almost seems to be the way he frames it.
Yeah, yeah. So again, then like, what do we do with all this? I mean, do we have a problem? I feel like we would agree that there's a problem. I think some of what Noll thinks is the problem isn't the major problem. I think he even acknowledges that the state of evangelical scholarship, there's been a renaissance of sorts. You have to acknowledge that. But I think just to be real practical without getting into like, oh, you must read this book or not read this book. Well, I mean, it is a serious book. It's worth reading, I suppose. But I think more practically, I mean, we kind of come back to some key points that I think, and the HSF for years has, I think, emphasized these kinds of things. But we want to love the Lord with our minds. And I think that we do, to echo Noll, we need to call out contradictions in the way that people sometimes distinguish between sort of, let's say, religious knowledge and secular knowledge. Like, knowledge of God's world is good, and it can be God honoring. I think that's where, if you have a good view of vocation, if you have a good view of common grace, you've got space for that. I think you're less prone to errors in making these radical, bifurcations. I think some people we need to recognize have been more gifted by the Lord with intellectual capabilities, and for them to be good stewards of those capabilities is probably going to mean at some point for many of them scholarly endeavors. And that doesn't have to mean the publication of books every other year or with reputable publishers all the time. I think we have to appreciate the fact that, you said this earlier, we're going to experience periods of persecution, which come in the intellectual realm, which come in the scholarly realm, professional societies that sometimes aren't hospitable to what we want to talk about or how we want to approach things. People will get passed over for jobs. Listen, man, I can remember just like, 12, 13 years ago when I was looking into PhD programs, I'd send an email, and I mean, you'll really like this. I don't know if I've ever told you this. So I had a link to the Hellas Society forum, like in the early days, at the bottom of my email. And I learned very quickly, like, that will not get you any friends. And of course, the site didn't look as good as it does now and all, but like, I guess I had emailed a couple of potential people I might would study with at schools in a PhD program. And there was someone, I think it was from Penn, University of Pennsylvania. And I guess they just clicked on the link and they just thought what we were doing was laughable. And of course, it was clear right off the bat, we were we were just raging fundamentalists. And this person wrote me an email back and was like, "Are you sure that you think you would be happy at a school like ours?" And man, it just, I feel so embarrassed about that email to this day. And I just can't imagine what it's like out there now. So, so all that said, I just don't think his original book takes that dynamic seriously enough. You know what I mean? I guess that's how I put it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get throughout the book that Noll really longs for, maybe even craves sort of evangelical respectability. It's like he wants us to be taken seriously, and I think that's fine and good in the sense that we want to be thoughtful, serious-minded people who are not given over to conspiracy theories. I think that's right and good, but I think at the same time we have to recognize, like you're saying with the Howard Society Forum, no matter how serious we are about intellectual pursuits, that if we don't agree on sort of the moorings of our society in our day, we're just going to be written off. And honestly, that I think that's one of the most powerful points in Truman's critique of this work is he says, Noll is concerned that the evangelical mind is that there is no mind. My concern is that there is no evangelical. And what he means by that is that we've given up on central teachings of Scripture, doctrine, the teachings of Scripture on morality and human sexuality and all of these things. And Truman's thing is, no matter how serious you are in these pursuits, you just need to know if you affirm these things that Scripture teaches, you're probably never going to be respectable. So I think that's a balancing tension where we can say Noll is right and we agree, but we need to come to it with that realization that you're going to be sort of whatever phobic if you affirm certain teachings that historic Christianity has affirmed.
Absolutely. And when guys are able to be faithful and they get an opportunity to do something great, publication wise or speaking, great. Don't be jealous, or envious. Celebrate it. Thank God for how He's using them in their domain. But we all just have to think very particularly about our own vocation. And I don't know how you feel about ending like a Thomas Kidd quote. Do you think I could share that with the viewers?
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes if you want to do that, and we'll close things up.
Yeah, I think Kidd is a great example of kind of what Mark Noll wants, but yet Noll is now at a seminary, which, we talked about. Maybe Noll wouldn't like that very much. But anyway, so he says, frankly, there's not much hope for reforming evangelicalism by those scholars who don't like typical evangelicals very much. Lobbing bombs over a virtual fence into enemy camps doesn't affect change. It just elicits more bomb throwing. This seems to represent the majority of traffic on Twitter, especially about evangelicals. Normal evangelicals are not interested in listening to wounded haters, nor should they be. They might accept insights from wounded lovers. Intellectual influence upon regular evangelicals, then, will have to be predicated upon faithful presence. The best people positioned to exercise influence upon evangelicals for the life of the mind are not necessarily the go-to voices on evangelicalism for the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're simply the people who believe in the importance of the life of the mind and who believe even more in the life of the church and in worshiping Jesus Christ. Along the way, those scholars who take this project on may have to get comfortable with being around evangelicals who do not necessarily agree with their politics, who, gasp, might have voted for Donald Trump, or who may not know or care who Mark Noll is. I just think that's characteristic Thomas Kidd there a little bit on trying to say, how do we sort of take all this on board, right? Anyway, there you go.
No, I think that's great. And again, to go back to something we were saying earlier, that balance between taking seriously the life of the mind, but also realizing that we're probably not going to have the sort of respectability that we might desire. Jackson, thanks for joining us. And thank you all for listening to this discussion of Mark Noll's The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. We hope it's been helpful, and we'll see you again soon.